Violence breaks out in Sudan overnight. Protest leaders blame forces linked to the former regime for disrupting the peace after the military council and civilian leaders agreed to a transitional power structure. The U.S. Secretary of State is in Russia. Mike Pompeo meeting his Russian counterpart and Vladimir Putin after Donald Trump voiced optimism about improving relations with Moscow. And France pays tribute to two special forces officers killed during a military operation to free hostages in Burkina Faso. The president said their mission was dangerous but necessary. It's good to have you with us here on France 24. First, 6 people were shot dead in overnight clashes in Sudan. Violence breaking out in several locations across the country. This after the military council and civilian leaders agreed to a power structure for Sudan's transition. Protest leaders blame forces linked to the former regime for inciting the violence. Earlier, I spoke to our correspondent Nadia Massi in Khartoum on what the atmosphere was like.
Very tense here in Khartoum today. Not as tense, of course, as it was last night, where live fire was ringing out across the city for hours. At least 6 people are reported killed and over 100 people wounded. But today, the atmosphere is clearly fractious. We travelled around the sit-in site this morning. It's very hard to actually get inside the sit-in today because the military and a militia loyal to the old regime has closed off a number of roads. Now, that's the militia. It's worth reminding our viewers that has been accused of carrying out much of that violence yesterday. Plenty of hostility towards them, very evident in the streets. Trucks full of those militiamen driving past with protesters running after them, trying to jump inside the trucks. And so the atmosphere remains very tense, and it's clear as well that protesters, despite that, want to stay in the streets. They are trying to extend their area of the sit-in to take in some of the key areas on Nile Street. That's one of the main arteries here in the capital, and to take in some of the ministries as well, including the oil ministry and the Ministry of Health.
Nadia, what are protesters you've been speaking with been saying after the violence last night? Do they want to continue this sort of dialogue with this military council?
Protesters are kind of split into 2 camps from the beginning, irrespective of the violence. There are some who believe that the opposition is an effective mechanism to work with the military to try and bring about a systemic change for Sudan. And there are others who believe that simply you shouldn't be negotiating with the military at all, that the military can't be trusted, that they're not an honest broker in these negotiations. Now, yesterday there was apparently something of a deal reached between the opposition parties and the military council as to what Sudan will look like going forward, what the power structures of transition will be. We've been told that there'll be an executive in Sudan, a legislature, and this ruling body, but we have very little details about what precisely that ruling body will be made up of. Chiefly, will it have a majority of military members who sit on it or civilian ones? And the concern among many protesters here is that it will still be military figures who dominate that body, meaning that the body of the old regime remains in power here, even though the former president Omar al-Bashir is no longer in power. So there are many people here who are very sceptical about those talks and those negotiations, but we are expecting to hear later on this evening a bit more details about what precisely has been agreed between the opposition and the military council.
Nadia Massi reporting there earlier from Khartoum. Now, the U.S. Secretary of State is in Russia. Mike Pompeo met his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, in Sochi. The two sides vowed to work together. Pompeo is now due to sit down with President Vladimir Putin. The meeting takes place a week after Donald Trump voiced optimism about improving relations with Moscow. For more on this story, we can bring in our international affairs editor, Armin Georgian. Armin, what do you make of the timing of this meeting?
Well, I think there's a domestic factor and an international one. Firstly, in the US, the summary of the Mueller report found no collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign. That doesn't mean to say that the whole 2016 election saga is over, but the summary seems to have given Trump a new confidence in matters related to Russia. And arguably, it is now a little bit more difficult for Trump's opponents to say, look, he's cozying up to Russia because he's indebted to Russia in some way from the 2016 campaign. So the Trump administration now clearly trying to set a new tone with Russia. And on that, let's take a listen now to Secretary of State Pompeo speaking at his meeting with the Russian foreign minister a bit earlier today.
I'm here today because President Trump is committed to improving this relationship. As I think you said, we have differences. Each country will protect its own interests, look out for its own interests of its people. But it's not destined that we're adversaries on every issue.
I mentioned an international factor as well, and that is the rising tensions in the Gulf. Russia and the US obviously both have interests when it comes to Iran. And just as in the Cold War, when things threatened to get out of hand, the two superpowers would talk. Now Russia and the US again are talking about matters related to Iran.
Speaking of Iran, Armin, there's a whole host of issues the United States and Russia do not agree on.
Yeah, I suppose Iran is probably the most pressing of those. Russia, of course, has energy interests in Iran. Iran is an ally for Russia in the Syrian conflict. And Russia, like the Europeans, does not want Iran to leave the nuclear deal. And yet Iran has in recent weeks signaled that it could reduce its compliance with the nuclear deal. The worry in Moscow is that when the US sends an aircraft carrier strike group and B-52 bombers to the Gulf, that kind of behavior simply pushes Iran further into a corner and speeds up the demise of the nuclear deal, which, after all, Russia did negotiate along with 5 other countries. So, yes, Iran is a major sticking point, but there are many others, Delano, which are preventing a Russia-US reset from happening at the moment. That's to say Venezuela, Syria, Ukraine, and the question of nuclear arms control.
Okay, we'll see what happens when we have Pompeo meeting Vladimir Putin later on today. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
In other news, France paid tribute to 2 special forces officers killed during a military operation to free hostages in Burkina Faso last week. The hostages were abducted from a wildlife reserve in Benin. The slain officers were part of France's Barkhane operation aimed at rooting out extremists in the Sahel. This Tuesday, French President Emmanuel Macron called their mission dangerous but necessary. Shirley Sitbon reports.
The fallen commandos' spouses, parents, and siblings brought their loved ones' portraits to the national tribute. Cédric de Pierrepont and Alain Bertoncelot in civilian clothing, the way they remember them. President Emmanuel Macron gave his condolences, along with his wife Brigitte Macron, in tears. The soldiers' comrades then brought their coffins into the military complex courtyard as the band played a Naval Forces song in their honor.
They died as heroes for France, because for them, nothing was more important than the mission and nothing more precious than the lives of the hostages.
The commandos were killed in the operation to save 2 French tourists kidnapped by gunmen who had taken them from Benin to Burkina Faso. President Macron said there was no other choice but to order that operation that led to the rescue of 4 hostages.
France never abandons its children, no matter the circumstances.
A reference to the controversy that followed the operation. France's foreign minister accused the tourists of traveling to an area that authorities formally advised not to visit. And there has been criticism against the tourists for taking that risk. But since the release, it has been revealed that months ago, authorities did not classify Benin's Pendjari Park as dangerous. The situation there degraded, though, in recent months and was flagged as orange, meaning no one should travel there unless it's absolutely necessary. After the kidnapping, the region was classified as a red zone. The tourists have voiced their regrets and sent their condolences to the grieving families.
Now, as France buries its soldiers, Mali is calling for more help from the European Union to secure the Sahel region. The West African country, along with other G5 members, are meeting in Brussels. As security has deteriorated in the region over the past decade, Mali's foreign minister says it's become a race against the clock. For more on this story, we can go across to France 24's Dave Keating in Brussels for us. Dave, I know those negotiations are still underway, but what do members of the G5 want exactly?
Yeah, as you say, we're still waiting for this meeting to break up and for the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Federica Mogherini, to come down here and brief us. But what we know is that the Sahel countries are very much stressing the point that violence is escalating and that the money that the EU has pledged to make the region a safer place needs to come faster. So this isn't necessarily about getting new monetary commitments, although they are asking for that as well. But really, particularly what the Malian foreign minister is stressing here today is that it needs to come faster, and getting access to the money needs to be easier. Basically, the procedures for getting the money need to be sped up. There have been 147 million euros allocated to these defense projects, to the G5 Sahel Joint Sahel Force, but on the ground, they're just not seeing that money come as fast and efficiently as they would like. Now, today's discussions with defense ministers are actually part of a 3-day discussion of the Sahel. Yesterday, foreign ministers discussed the diplomatic situation and adopted conclusions ahead of today's meeting with defense ministers, and that's when the Sahel representatives, the G5, came to join the meeting. So it should say something that they picked the day of the defense ministers meeting as the day to come. It should say something about their priorities. Now, on Thursday, they're going to discover development funding. That funding has been a little bit easier to get flowing. That's a total of 8 billion euros over this current budgetary period. And because it's a little less controversial and a little less complicated, that money comes faster. But what the Sahel countries are asking for right now, given the recent developments and the urgency of the situation, is that military help to be prioritized.
Now, Dave, as you've been saying, it's been a busy week for the EU's foreign policy chief, Federica Mogherini. Realistically speaking, how big a priority is the Sahel for her?
Yeah, I mean, the recent events have been very tragic and have gotten a lot of attention in France. But the fact is, for a lot of the foreign ministers here, there are some really big issues that they're grappling with, not least among which is Iran. Yesterday, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, paid a surprise visit to Brussels, kind of crashed the foreign ministers' meeting. And yesterday, they were supposed to be discussing Libya. So Iran and Libya together are already two huge issues that the foreign ministers are discussing here this week. Now, Libya, of course, is somewhat related to the Sahel because a lot of people going to Libya are coming from the Sahel region and then wanting to come on to Europe. But Iran is kind of a different challenge. And I would say that that issue is really sucking up a lot of the oxygen here in Brussels. So I would be surprised to see any major new commitments coming out of this meeting as they exit now and deliver their press conferences. But we'll see, as we say, Iran is really the big focus in Brussels this week.
Okay, Dave, thank you very much for that update. Dave Keating reporting there for us from Brussels. Now, the Cannes Film Festival is kicking off in a few hours. Zombie comedy The Dead Don't Die premiering this Tuesday. Cannes is once again clashing with modernity, with no Netflix films being screened this year once again. Peter O'Brien reports.
Bill Murray, Tilda Swinton, Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio. This year, Cannes is drawing the big guns. Notably in the form of Quentin Tarantino, who finished his film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood just in time to flood the red carpet with A-listers.
This is made with a studio. Sony made this film and is releasing it. So it's suddenly a huge, huge film for Tarantino. He's always been connected to the independent cinema scene. Now he's a studio director for the first time.
Cannes is looking to remain the world's top cinema showcase in a field increasingly dominated by streaming sites and as competition heightens with other festivals. It prides itself on shining a light on newcomers and films which are less commercial, but it's also under pressure to stay relevant. On last year's red carpet, 82 women protested gender inequality in the industry. This time, 4 female directors are competing for the top award out of 21 films. The festival's director has defended its selection process and released data showing only a quarter of the submissions they received were directed by women.
We expect things of Cannes which we don't expect of other festivals, which we don't expect of other organizations. At the moment, I feel like I'm never talking about cinema. I'm only talking about social issues.
This year's main selection also sees the return of several veterans, like Ken Loach and Pedro Almodovar. To open the festival on Tuesday and prove it's alive and kicking, Jim Jarmusch's zombie extravaganza, the dead don't die.
Horrifying is coming.
That's it from me. Thank you very much for watching.